Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Turner, Doctor of Physical Therapy and Certified Strength Coach, Functional Strength Coach, and I am the Cheer PT. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk a little bit about my 3 top tips for how to improve your flexibility in your toe touches and your heel stretches. So I hear all the time, my cheerleader can't progress with their toe touches, or they're really struggling to get their flexibility on their heel stretch, and they're stretching all the time and they're just not making progress. If you're stretching all the time, it's probably not a need to get more flexibility. The hamstrings, we're going to go into a little bit of anatomy to start, but the hamstrings attach at your sit bones, those 2 bones on the bottom of your butt that when you sit on, you feel them. They're called the ischial tuberosity. There's 3 heads of the hamstrings, so there's 3 different parts. 2 of those hamstrings attach on the inside part of the knee, and the other one attaches down at the outside part of the knee, down at the fibular head, which is the bone on the outside of your lower leg. So it's a 2-joint muscle. It crosses 2 joints. So we need to make sure that we have both ends of those that muscle moving appropriately. The hamstring, what it does when it shortens, it extends the hip and flexes the knee. And there is some rotational component and a little bit of lateral work also at different portions, depending on how it's moving. Now that's probably too much information. You don't really need to know that, other than, to get both ends. It's important to get both ends of the hamstring, and to recognize that it attaches at the pelvis. Those sit bones is actually the pelvis, which is the lower portion of your core. So my first thing you need to do is figure out, is it actually a mobility or a mobility issue in the joints, or is it a stability issue of the muscles? Sometimes the hamstrings will just lock down because of where they attach at the sit bones. They lock down for something that's weaker above or below. So determining, are they just holding on like guide wires, and if you stretch them, it's actually just going to make them more tight because they're holding on and gripping for something that's not working right up above. So determining whether it's a mobility or a stability dysfunction, and looking at the fact that as when we do a jump or we do a heel stretch, we are putting those hamstrings on stretch by flexing the hip and externally rotating the hip and abducting the hip. So we are stretching as we are doing our jump, and then they need to shorten quick as we come into our landing. Our joints need to act, and the muscles will react into them. If we go higher than our joints are going to allow, and our joints aren't moving properly, so if the hip joint isn't able to actually go into that flexion, the hamstrings are at their end of motion is going to react to pull them in. And so the height of that jump or heel stretch is going to be limited because of that. So first tip, finding out, is it a mobility or a stability issue? Is it the joint mobility that actually needs some work and greasing up the hip joints and kind of getting the hips to move a little bit more freely? Or is it a stability issue that they're gripping and locking down for something else? Or maybe those hamstrings are weak and they can't eccentrically load to be able to get that height, along with the opposite muscles that actually shorten as we do the jump, our hip flexors and our abductors. And my second tip, we got to figure out, is it actually a core stability? So like I said, those hamstrings attach at the bottom part of the pelvis, which is the lower portion of the core. Our core needs to be strong and stable. Our core needs to be able to hold still and kind of lock down, per se. I don't like the word lock because I think that, you get a lot more gripping when we talk about locking, and sometimes it's important to let that relax and to be able to move our rib cage and our pelvis, which is what our core does, in the front and the back. We need to be able to move them, but we also need to be able to hold them steady for things like walking, jumping, running, heel stretches. All of this between our shoulders and our hips need to stay still. And in order for them to be in a centered position, in a more neutral position, and the right length tension so that they get that good contraction, we need to be able to pull our ribs down, and not so much that we need to super posterior pelvic tilt, but that we're not arching our back into a real anterior tilt and extension through our lower back and our spine. So we need to be able to keep those ribs down, and we need to be able to have a slight neutral pelvic tilt. And in order to get that, we need to be able to move the rib cage up and down, the pelvis forward and back, and the rib cage goes back and forth also. But we need to be able to hold them steady. So how do you determine that? Looking if the hips are tight and not moving, you might get more motion at the core where we want that more stability. If the hips are overworking, you might be so locked down that you're not actually able to get good stability and being able to hold that steady as we go. We need a stable core with mobile legs. My third tip, after we've done some static stretching, it's important to add some functional exercise and some stability or strength exercises afterwards, so that after we loosen something up, we train it to work in the right pattern that we're looking for. This is there is some research out that has been done that shows that static stretching actually decreases performance and strength. But I believe the current research has shown that, for the initial 30 seconds. So if someone's going out to pull a heel stretch and they do a quick stretch beforehand, they may not, if they're just going into that static stretch and not actively activating those muscles, it may actually lessen the stretch and the ability to stretch. So static stretching is helpful at times. And sometimes it just feels really good. To get a good full stretch, you need to do about 60 seconds of each muscle in the right range of motion and strength and mobility, the different planes of motion. But then we need to do some activation afterwards. So incorporating some exercises in standing. So backtrack. If we're doing a lying down stretch and we're pulling our leg up towards our face and keeping the knee nice and straight, and we're holding there for about 60 seconds, you might then you might let your leg come down after that and do some just active motion up and down, or moving in the direction of the stretch or the jump that you're going to do. Or you might add some weight to it and do some resistance work there. That could be a lying down exercise. But what about, when you're standing? So we have standing hamstring stretches, which I think are actually excellent in being able to improve our mechanics. And then you can take that from a passive or a holding stretch that you're just statically stretching and you're just hanging out there for 60 seconds, and go right into a dynamic motion that mimics what you've just been doing, while also using the muscles on either side of the joint, working on that core and the core mobility and stability in both directions. You might go right into, you do your static stretch, do some activation, because we got to get those muscles working on either side of the joint, and then get right into your the activity, on the ground, whether you're doing leg raises, kicks, or pulling up into that heel stretch and kind of coming up and down to be able to, actively use the hip flexor muscles as opposite the hamstrings that you've just isolated and stretched. I hope that makes sense. So 3 tips. Figure out, is it actually a mobility or a stability issue that's holding you back? Determine if you actually need to do more core stabilization. And that doesn't mean crunches, and planks are great if you do them correctly and you can actually get yourself into that stable position. And if you can do planks for days, then maybe you need to add some leg motion in there so that you're holding your core still while doing some leg or some arm work. 3rd tip, add function after you've done some static stretching. Do some more dynamic work. So do your static stretching first, and then do some dynamic, which means moving while you are stretching. So creating some eccentric length to get better, so you actually strengthen the muscle at the same time as you're stretching it. Mobility versus stability, core, and create some function and dynamic movement to take your joints and your muscles through the available motions that they need to. 4th extra tip, all of our muscles and our joints move in 3 planes of motion. So take those joints through those different planes of motion, because maybe it's, if we always are stretching up towards our head, we may actually need to be stretching at a different angle with some twist or some rotation, or some out to the side, some abduction, frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane. So try it in 3 different directions and see if that helps to make a difference also. Hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, please send me an email and I'm happy to talk more with you. I'll leave the email below, and try these out. If you need to find someone to actually do some assessment, you can reach out to me and we can talk and we can figure out where you need to go specific for you. Thanks so much for joining. I'll see you next time.